Hello. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our seminar today, Behind the Consumption Smokescreen and How Sweden Can Become a True Role Model. We are going to start in just a few minutes because we have a special guest, our first speaker with us virtually from England. And before that, I'd like to just take a couple of housekeeping rules. And the number one is, of course, telephones. And if you wouldn't mind, please see that they're either on silent and everyone reaches in their pockets, something we forget. And if you have some urgent call to take, please just take it outside of the room. And the other is that I'll give you just a couple of ideas about what the time frame looks like for today, because we gave a very rough outline in the agenda or the program that was attached to the invitation. At approximately 3 o'clock, we'll have a coffee break for 20 minutes. And after that, we'll have a panel discussion, hoping to end at about 4:45. So we'll just be ending a bit earlier in order to refurnish the room for the book launch and mingle that will be following the seminar, to which, of course, you're all most warmly welcome. The organizers of this seminar are Cogito, WWF, which is also Världsnaturfonden, and What Next? So I will turn the floor over to Richard Valenius from the Cogito, who will offer a welcome. Here you go, Richard.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, yeah. Thank you very much. I'm, as mentioned, Richard Valenius from Cogito, a green think tank in Sweden. We're trying to insert some green thinking into the public debate here. And I just want to mention that this seminar is actually part of a wider project on climate justice that we have been arranging for quite a time now. And last spring we had 3 seminars in different locations in Sweden, collecting politicians, scientists, NGOs, the public, to discuss local carbon action or climate action measures, but in the light of the global injustices of emissions. And then we published, in collaboration with Stockholm Environment Institute, this little report, Global Environmental Impact and Local Footprints, and it's very interesting, and please get a copy. I think it's over there at the table. And which was the first analysis of the total carbon footprint or consumption-based emissions of 4 major Swedish cities. And today we are very happy to have with us one leading international expert on carbon footprints, Mr. Glen, who will talk to us soon. And actually we started to plan this very seminar after an article by Mr. Peters and 3 other colleagues of him, which I presume unintentionally caused a debate on whether Sweden's emissions were increasing or decreasing. Because one table in the appendix seemed to suggest that even when adopting this consumption-based emissions measurements, it looked as Sweden's emissions were decreasing, which of course would be very welcome, but a bit sensational. So there were some quite important forces in the Swedish debate that took this as a kind of final proof of Sweden's decoupling emission growth from economic growth. Among others, the soon-to-be Minister for Enterprise, Annie Lööf, and a couple of think tanks, Forest, which is kind of center-right, and Timbro, which is more right, or whatever. And we thought perhaps that, well, maybe you couldn't use the figures in that way, but we're very excited to have Mr. Peters here and to hear about what he will say about this. But this seminar will also take a little wider approach to climate justice, Sweden's responsibility, and the challenge we are facing. And therefore we have released today our second report, which is this, and it's a Swedish translation of a recent article by Professor Kevin Anderson, taken from this volume that we will launch after this seminar. And this is really an eye-opening, I think, report. And as you know, Mr. Kevin will soon be making a presentation for us. So right after me, Niklas will just introduce the rest of this seminar and all our distinguished guests. I just wanted to say welcome from us, Cogito. We have a really constructive collaboration also with WWF and Next Forum. So very much welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Rickard. Again, very much welcome. Very happy to see you all here for a very exciting afternoon. We're convinced this will be very exciting, so we dare to choose a room without windows. But we will do have some coffee in the meantime, just as a sort of safeguard. I'll just tell you, well, obviously it was already said, there's two components to this afternoon, and they do really relate to each other. So after this substantial seminar, do stay on 5 to 6 for the launching of this book that is waiting in boxes, so you don't sort of slip away and wait for it. If you have very urgent reasons to leave, they can come up and get a copy maybe before leaving, before the launch. But it will be launched, and we're very excited about this book, which is published by the Next Forum and the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, who are then collaborating on the launch specifically. As already was said, two of the authors in this book are here with us. Dale, who is here in the front row, and also Kevin, who is hopefully listening in now. Hi, Kevin, in the UK.
Can you hear me?
Yes, excellent. Hi, Kevin.
Excellent. Hello, good to speak to you.
Excellent, you're here with us. So Kevin is in Manchester, I suppose, where he's based. So that's very, very, very excellent, of course, to have those two authors of the book, among many others, of course, that contributed here with us for this seminar. And I just thought I would just spend not much time at all, but I thought I would, let me see. Just try to set this in a context, this seminar and meeting, and let me see if I can get this a little, okay, maybe it's okay like that. Maybe it doesn't work, that's kind of strange. Here we go, okay. So basically, this is not to get into much of detail, but in the center we have the seminar, which is really, have several components. One is climate justice, and it's also part of the overall seminar series that Rickard introduced, Crossroads for Climate Justice, and Behind the Consumption Smokescreen, so taking that twist. But it also has this other subtitle, How Can Sweden Become a True Role Model? And we'll try to grapple with both of these things, and I think the latter perhaps even more so in the panel that will follow towards the end of the program. But just to be, of course, aware that climate justice, that really is a very multi-dimensional notion, and it's coming to the fore very much so as we speak, day by day. That goes for the climate negotiations, but also beyond, of course. So just to point out a few of these dimensions, of course, we have the whole issue of emissions and atmospheric space, the whole equity dimension of that. And Kevin will, of course, go right into that and do take that small Swedish booklet as well. It's very, very hard-hitting and challenging and good. Coupled to that, issues of past emissions, historical responsibility, the sort of adaptation debt and so on, and it all goes within some kind of notion of climate debt that has come to the fore over the last few years, And it's been a contested notion even, but it's certainly at the fore of both debates and civil society discussions and so on. But we have also more than that, more than just emissions, right? It's a question of right to sustainable development, which is coupled to finance and technology transfers from the north to the south to enable these countries to develop whatever we mean with that, while even going drastically down towards zero with some lag in the south. That has never happened before. How will that happen? Kevin will definitely shed some light on the challenges at least. We have implications of solutions. Once we realize a problem and really realize we need to go bold and fast, what are the implications of the choices of solutions we make? Do we go for big fixes and fast fixes, geoengineering, for example, and other things that might lead us to even more inequities and more problems, or do we choose solutions that actually do solve many problems at the same time? That's a very definite equity dimension as well. And we have, of course, issues around inequities also within countries, which has been also a taboo in the international scene for some good reasons, but it's coming back to the fore also now when we look into the current negotiations, I think, even more. And of course, that whole cluster of negotiations, which, just to point out, is not the primary purpose of today, to go into the details of the intricacies of the UNFCCC negotiations. But of course, we can recognize that it is the contested notion. It has to do with clash of paradigms, north-south divides, the Kyoto Protocol, and many more things, including this mandate for a new unknown agreement that was decided on last year in Durban. And I just came back yesterday from a meeting in Brussels called by the Swedish government and the Belgian government that explicitly tackled equity and brought negotiators together, north and south, almost for the first time actually, to explicitly talk about this. It's been so sensitive with Chatham House rules approaches, which I think was actually good. A very welcome move by Sweden in this regard to start to build the bridges north and south that is so badly needed, if not to just understand how we understand these issues. So we'll see what happens in Doha in 2 weeks' time, but certainly the notion of equity, the very small, tiny remaining carbon space, atmospheric space, will come in there. And we then have, of course, the whole issue of consumption, and that's already been introduced, and we have experts in the room. Just to look at this part too, in terms of what does it mean to become a role model, well, we can have very many different kinds of ideas, of course, and different kinds of biases to that, but just to build a few, or just throw out a few things here, or throw a few things on the table, of course, we have the radical domestic cuts. Isn't that part of being a role model, especially if you're based in the north? And again, Kevin will give us some pretty hard-hitting figures here, what that actually would mean. Bridge building and talking with the south, and I think this seminar as of yesterday was a good notion in that regard from Sweden. Building new alliances, and I think not the least Dale will also, with her China background, move into that and as challenge us a bit as to maybe it would make sense for Europe to move closer to China and rather than being too close and caught up with the US politics that can't deliver anything, whether you have a Democratic or Republican president, in my view at least. And we have the whole trust building and moving first kind of issues as well on this whole notion of becoming a role model. So we'll see what we get into in the panel and the kind of discussions we'll have in terms of ideas and creative ideas, but also perhaps debate as to whether Sweden already are and are we doing enough and what kinds of role models should we be. So I'll just leave it by that, and we'll again have a bit of a zooming in here on the consumption dimension, but just to be aware that it's part of a much larger picture, and of course it all ties together as always. So by that, I'd like to hand over to Barbara, our eminent moderator of the day, who will guide us and who will also call on Kevin to set the real presentations in motion, right?
Great.
So please, Barbara.
Thank you, Niklas, and thank you also to Rickard for great introductions. I'm Barbara Väs, and I am the climate the manager for climate communications at WWF here in Sweden, who's been given the honor to represent WWF in this context. WWF, that's a mouthful. I have several colleagues here as well. Stefan Henningsson, whom you'll meet soon in the panel, and Carina Borgström Hansson, who is here someplace and has been the brains behind this operation from WWF side, as well as many others. So what I'd like to do now, before we lose any more time, is to turn over the floor, virtually that is, to Kevin Anderson, who is the Deputy Director at the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research in the UK. So Kevin, it's all yours. Take it away.
Can you see my presentation there?
We can.
Yes. You can, and just let me do one quick check. If I smooth the slides, is it moving?
Yes.
Yeah, good, okay, that's great. Well, fine. Well, hello to you all over there. This is a low carbon event, so this is quite good to have this actually up and working. We need to do more of this. I'm going to spend the next 30 minutes or so trying to lay out the challenge from a global perspective, particularly in terms of mitigation, in terms of reducing the emissions. I've called this talk Real Clothes for the Emperor. I think you probably have the same story in Sweden, in that the emperor streaks past naked and it's only the young child that yells out that the emperor has no clothes on. I would say that the emperor of mitigation clearly has no clothes on at all. Probably the emperor of adaptation also has no clothes on. So we have a streaking emperor in terms of climate change, and I'm going to try to discuss what the clothes might look like that this emperor of climate change would need to wear if we were to try and meet our obligations that we have signed up to. Before going on, can you all hear me clearly?
Yes.
Oh, very good. Okay. Right, I'm going to start by just setting the context. This is a quote I'm going to put up now from the International Energy Agency, from Fatih Birol, and Fatih Birol is their chief economist. So this is not a left-leaning think tank. This is the IEA, and they have traditionally been much more closely associated with the fossil fuel industry. So this is interesting that they're prepared to say this. And they are saying now, very clearly, that we're on track for a 3.5 degrees C temperature rise by 2040, which compared to the pre-industrial period is about 4 degrees or so higher than we saw before we started to burn fossil fuels. Fatih Birol goes on to say, when I look at the trend, this is perfectly in line with a temperature increase of 6 degrees Celsius, which would have devastating consequences for the planet. That's 6 degrees by the end of the century. And it's interesting to see that from PricewaterhouseCoopers yesterday, there was a report that came out that said also the same thing, that we are heading towards a 6 degrees C rise during this century. The final thing that I'm going to take from the IEA is that they say we have 5 years to change the energy system, or have it changed. Have it changed by legislation, but also have it changed, of course, by a changing environment. And it's really important to bear in mind, he says energy system there, not energy supply. And I think that's really very important for what it is that we can do in the short term. The system opens it up to demand issues as well. So that's from Fatih Birol about where we're actually heading. But what have we all signed up to? And of course Sweden is a signatory to the Copenhagen Accord and the Cancun Agreement as well. And to hold the increase in global temperature below, notice that, below, not a 50-50 chance of, below 2 degrees Celsius, and take action to meet this objective consistent with the science, and that's quite a radical statement really, but even more radical, and on the basis of equity. The US, the UK, virtually everyone in Europe, many parts of the world have now signed up to this. Most countries in the world have signed up to this, and I think we need to hold this up to governments repeatedly, that we have signed up to this Copenhagen Accord. It has, like most international agreements, has very little that's legally binding, but we have actually, we are obliged morally to abide by it because we have signed up to it. Now my question then is, how consistent are these two different views, the 4 and 6 degrees C future of the IEA and the 2 degrees C future of what we've signed up to? How consistent are they with where we're going on the emissions and the trends in climate change? So here we have in front of you, I hope you've got a graph in front of you now, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, excellent. What you've got here is a graph with on the left-hand axis, billion tonnes of carbon dioxide, gigatons, the measure we typically use for measuring carbon dioxide. This is from fossil fuel. And along the bottom you've got the century running out to 2050. And this is stuff you'll be quite familiar with, but I think it's just reminding ourselves of where we are now. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN body that sort of brings together the science on climate change, was established in 1988. Their first report came out in 1990. And look what's happening to the emissions. You can see the emissions there already starting to go up compared with 1980. The Rio Earth Summit, some of you may remember, some of you may have attended, was in 1992. The second report from the IPCC was in 1997. This is a British report that was very influential in UK government policy, the Royal Commission report that came out in 2000. And the third report in 2001 from the IPCC, our chief scientist here made the comment that climate change was the most dangerous threat that civilization faced, and particularly talking in the UK at that time about terrorism, and that climate change was much more dangerous. The fourth report was 2007. The Copenhagen event in 2009, 2010. Look what's happening to the emissions here, just keep going up and up. Rio plus 20 this year. Every year we talk about climate change, the emissions keep on rising, keep going up and up. So the more we talk about it, the more academics fly around the world to discuss it, the higher the emissions become. And I think there might be some correlation between those two. It's also worth pointing out that I would argue that we haven't really had globalisation for very long. The groundwork for a globalised world, of trade in particular, was really set, was being set up to about 2000. And only really since 2000, and only really with China and perhaps South Korea and one or two other parts of the world, has globalisation taken off. So I think we're in the very early phases of a globalised world, particularly in relation here to trade. I'm not saying it's a good or a bad thing, I'm just saying that we haven't really engaged with lots of the parts of the poor parts of the world yet, and there looks to me to be lots more scope for lowly paid labour providing very cheap goods, which drives increased consumerism. So it doesn't seem to me there's any process at the moment that's naturally bringing that globalisation, that consumption agenda to a halt. Except for, of course, the economists, who at last have started to realise climate change is an issue, and they've tried to trigger, along with the bankers, a global economic downturn. So there has been now some shift in how the economy is developing. But at the same time, despite the global economic downturn, and this is particularly in the West, emissions rose between 2009 and 2010 by 5.9%. Now that is higher than at any point during the Industrial Revolution. So think about this, we're now concerned about climate change, and in 2009-10 the emissions grew faster than at any time during our history as an industrialised world. Since then, with increasing economic downturn, that increase has dropped, but it's about 3%, 3.2% for 10-11, and probably 2.6, 2.8% for the last year. But still a very significant increase in emissions year on already a very high number. So what of the future? Well, if we think about the energy system that we're building in place, that we're putting in place now, supply technologies, if we build a nuclear power station, a wind turbine, a coal-fired power station with carbon capture and storage, whatever it might be, they typically last about 25 to 50 years. If we think about large infrastructure, sewage networks, water networks, the grid system for transmitting electricity, the built environment, the houses we're in, the building you're in today, these normally last again 30 to 100 years. And then we think of things like aircraft and ships and some of the bigger pieces of our infrastructure that we move around, they typically last 30 years or so. So whatever we do now, whatever we build now is locking ourselves into several decades of a high carbon, a high fossil fuel use future. If you combine that, remember this is what most people in the world are doing. Chinese are building at the moment about 150 international airports. 150 international airports in China. Now, if the Chinese flew as much as we fly in the UK, they would need to have 450. So we should not complain about the Chinese when we are the ones that are causing this problem. But if we think now that emissions in the OECD, Sweden, UK, US, wealthy parts of the world, if they start to reduce from now, which is roughly what they're doing very slowly anyway, if India and Africa join the globalisation agenda sometime over the next 15 or so years, if China and India can then peak their emissions by 2030, 2045, that sort of time frame, and if you talk to the Indians and Chinese, that's the sorts of time frames that they're talking about being as early as they could imagine peaking their emissions. If Africa peaks its emissions by 2060, and obviously it's very low now, if you start to plot that, what does it look like? Well, you get a curve that looks like this. Remember, this is a mitigation curve. This is a curve that's actually probably more optimistic than where we're heading at the moment. And if you added that up, that's about 5 billion, those numbers, sorry, I should say 3,000 and 5,000, not 3 and 5 gigatons. That's about 5,000 billion tons of carbon dioxide over this century. which is about a 4 to 6 degrees C rise. So what the IEA, what the PricewaterhouseCoopers report is saying, is borne out by the trends in emissions and by actually the mitigation policies that we're putting in place. So we're falling far, far short of what we've signed up to at 2 degrees C. And I'll plot on there, now if you look at that, that curve is for an outside chance of 2 degrees C. For an outside chance. And just look at the gap between those two. This is enormous, absolutely huge. We are far, far removed from anything approaching what we've signed up to. So why is it we still talk about 2 degrees C? Why is it people think it's important? And why is it so many reports say that it's viable? I've just called this section here an orthodox view of 2 degrees C. Look at the emperor's undergarments. Now I'm going to talk about two reports here. That I apologise, these are UK reports, but I'm much more familiar with the UK literature on this. This is taken from our Committee on Climate Change, an independent committee set up by the government. And this is a report that came out in 2009 and again in 2011. And they're saying to keep global average temperature rise close to 2 degrees C, this magical number, the UK must cut emissions by 80%. But this is the important bit. The good news is that reductions of that size are possible without sacrificing the benefits of economic growth and rising prosperity. And basically, if you don't say that, no one takes notice of what you say. So you have to say that we can have economic growth and deal with climate change. And everyone's saying this, unfortunately, without justification for it. This is from a EU report looking at the situation for the EU that came out in 2010 from Mike Hume. A low stabilisation target of 450 parts per million CO2e can be achieved at moderate cost and a high likelihood of achieving that goal. Bear in mind that we're already above that. So the report came out in 2010 and is suggesting that we can hit a target that's below where we are today at moderate cost. So I would argue this is not the real world at all. To me, the emperor still looks naked. We still have to rethink, well, what does the emperor really look like? And this is an alternative take from one of the papers that my colleague Alice Bowes and I wrote that's had a lot of, well, it's been used a lot by lots of people engaging on climate change now. It's published by the Royal Society in 2008, and we had a follow-up in 2011. And we would argue it's difficult to envisage anything short of a planned economic recession, contraction, a smaller economy, particularly in the wealthy parts of the world, being compatible with stabilisation at or below 650 ppmv. Now that's basically at or below 4 degrees C. So even a 4 degrees C future, we are saying, will be enormously challenging from an emissions reduction point of view for the wealthy parts of the world, for the UK, for Sweden, for the EU, the US and so forth. So however you view the future, it looks extremely difficult for us for mitigation. Now, do scientists take some responsibility for this? Are we in some way culpable for this, what I would say is a completely naive view of where we are heading to? Now, as I say, slowly the IEA, PwC are starting to question this. But think about what we've done in terms of scientists here. This is the Copenhagen Accord, to hold below 2 degrees C. This is the EU, do not exceed. Notice the language here, do not hold below, not a 50-50 chance of. And in the UK, we have rise no more than 2 degrees C as part of our low carbon transition plan. And yet, if you look at the IPCC, they would say that this sort of language is saying very unlikely to exceptionally unlikely chance of exceeding 2 degrees C. That's what we're setting up, and they then relate that to probabilities, and these are really very important. A lot of the misunderstanding and deliberate manipulation of climate change is hidden in these probabilities. So they're saying that what we're signing up to is a less than 10% chance of exceeding 2 degrees C. So we should really make every effort to hit our targets, going by our language. And despite that, the UK government, and indeed any government that has put in carbon budgets in place, are not putting in keeping with that 10%. The UK government has adopted the policy of a pathway that's a 63% chance, a very high chance, of exceeding what we've signed up to. So that is completely incompatible with the Copenhagen Accord. And Sweden, EU, the rest of the world is no better than this. No one is prepared to move the emissions towards what we're saying we are going to do. So the language we're writing in our international negotiations is completely different to the language we're domestically constructing and the policies we're putting in place. But that's bad enough, but actually we move much further from the science, and the scientists have stayed quiet through all of this. We hear nothing from the scientists about this. This is a language, I think you're probably all familiar with this sort of language. A large reduction, 50, 80% reduction in emissions by 2050. We would say here, but not in my term of office. The politicians will no longer be in their positions. Our business leaders will have retired on a nice big pension, and us academics will have also joined them in retiring. We can leave it to technology to solve the problem in 2030 and 2040. And that's the sort of language we have typically heard. But this has no basis in science. No scientist should ever use this language, and yet they repeatedly use it as a shorthand and then come to believe it in the end. The carbon dioxide from this event, I can see the lights on in the room that you're on now. The lights in your room, some of that will no doubt will not be fossil fuel, but some of that will be fossil fuel power that we're putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The projector, the lights where I am, in the room I am, we're putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that will change the climate for the next 100 to 200 years. So we are changing the climate today with this presentation. This suggests that 2050 reductions have nothing to do with climate change. They have it is what we are putting out today, this afternoon, tomorrow, what we put out the last few years. That's the period that really matters, the cumulative emissions. And that's the take-home message, really. That is not about long-term targets. They are irrelevant from a climate perspective. They have no basis in science. What matters, and the only thing that matters, are cumulative budgets, the emissions that build up day in, day out. And the reason we don't like that is it rewrites the chronology. It rewrites the timeline from long-term gradual reductions, where technology can solve the problem, to urgent and radical reductions. We need to do something now, this afternoon, tomorrow morning. So it changes the agenda from our children and future leaders can solve the problem with technology, to it's our responsibility to do something immediately. And that is scientifically robust. That's what the science tells us around 2 degrees centigrade. So how does this scientifically credible approach change the 2 degrees C challenge? Well, firstly, let's think about where we are today. And these are things, again, you're probably all familiar with, but almost anything you plot for human beings looks like this. Population, car ownership, how often we fly, how many televisions we have, how many meters squared or cubed our houses are. Everything about humans is pretty much exponential. And we're sufficiently arrogant as a species to think that we can carry on doing this and survive. No other species, we would know it would be going to die out, become extinct, if it carried on doing this. But this is what we're doing with emissions, and we're doing it with everything else. It's also worth bearing in mind then the rate of growth. That for the last 100 years, up to 2000, the growth rate in carbon dioxide was about 2.7% per year. We started talking about climate change in the 1990s, particularly at the Rio Earth Summit in '92. And yet since 2000, when we spent all of our time talking about climate change, emissions have gone up. The rate of increase of emissions has gone up. So we're in 3.5%. That's a big increase from our historical precedent. In 2009-10 was 5.9%, the latest numbers are sort of 3.2-3% or so. So what I'm saying there is the rate of growth is faster now than we saw throughout the whole of the last century, and every day it goes up from a larger number. So the scale of the challenge becomes exponentially more difficult every day we decide not to do anything. So we bring together our abject failure to reduce emissions with the science on cumulative emissions. What does that tell us about our 2 degrees C pathways? Firstly, the earlier we can peak our emissions, then the lower is the reduction rate after that peak. So it's less challenging from a mitigation point of view. But when can we peak by? What are the discussions around that? If we imagine we can peak in 2015, now, unfortunately my pointer won't work on your screen. So if you can see the emissions going up from the left-hand side here, they're going up to a peak in 2015, and this is from a paper in 2008, so I've not put the economic recession in here, up to 2015 peak, and then they come down. And what you see is a number of curves there. Those curves represent the uncertainty in the science, and like all good science, there's a lot of uncertainty. If the science is certain, then it's not science. So we always get this uncertainty. And notice that the line goes on, it never goes to zero, it always stays above zero. And whilst people live on the planet, you can never get emissions to zero. And that's because we don't want to eat food. Every time we plough a field or put fertiliser on a field, whatever we do, we will be releasing greenhouse gases, methane, N2O, nitrous oxide, into the atmosphere. So we can never get that down to zero. And remember, what matters here is the area under the curve. Now, if we leave it to peak later in 2020, you see that if we have to come off the curve, the reduction rate is steeper. You can see it much more clearly now if we peak by 2025. Now, if you just sit there thinking to yourselves, when do you think global emissions are likely to peak? I mean, about climate change, why is that the case? And I've just summarised this now, that many of the analysis and scenarios, what they do, firstly, They deliberately have mistaken and massaged historical data. So they haven't taken emissions growing at the rate they have been growing. Even though we collect this data, the models that we run just extrapolate from the 1990s. They don't use the latest emissions data, which says that we're growing at 3% or more. They generally use something like 1 to 2% at most. They keep the emissions growing at low levels at 1 to 2% out to a peak. So the emissions aren't growing at 1 to 2%, they're growing at 3 or 4 or 5. So already they're starting to massage the next year and the year after that. They have a peak in emissions that's Machiavellian, but they are dangerously misleading. They assume the emissions are going to peak in 2015. Some analysis say it's going to peak in 2010. Now, there's virtually nothing that's out there, low carbon futures, that says it's going to peak in 2020. And yet that is much more realistic, and that itself is very challenging. So every point they use is to try and make it look more acceptable to us as individual citizens, policymakers. The reduction rate off the top of the curve is dictated by economists' view, I call them astrologists, economists' view of what is compatible with economic growth. So they're saying you can only come down at 2 to 4% because anything above that affects economic growth. And whatever we do, we can burn the planet, but we mustn't affect economic growth. They all assume, almost across the board, that we'll have geoengineering, that will work. Of course, we don't know it will work. We need to experiment with it, but we don't know it will work. They have very naive views of big technology. I've spent a lot of time working on big technology. I used to work offshore on the oil rigs. We can do a lot as engineers, we cannot perform miracles, and big technology does not get put out there very quickly. It takes many years. I'll ignore that one for now. The other thing, we have a magician's view of time. We think the bull can go into the china shop, can break all the china, come back out of the china shop, and then we can go in with some super glue, with some geoengineering, and we can fix the climate, we can fix the damage we've caused. That does not fit with the science. There are some basic thermodynamic rules here around entropy that say that once we've destroyed things, in this case, we cannot simply go back to where we were. So every time we were starting to wreck the climate, we cannot simply reverse that by some magical technology. So why is 2 degrees C? Why has it become so important? Why has it dominated the discourse? Now I'm going to use some examples here in the UK. I'm sure you find the same things in Sweden. I have a colleague who's a very senior political scientist in one of the major universities here and engages a lot with government on this. These are direct quotes from a discussion I had with him. He's a friend of mine, I should say, but I won't name him. Too much is invested in 2 degrees C for us to say it is not possible. It would undermine all that's been achieved. It would give a sense of hopelessness. We may as well just give in. So I asked him directly, are you suggesting we, as scientists, should lie about our research findings? Well, perhaps just be not so honest, more dishonest. So already there's a pressure on us as scientists to not be honest about our analysis, to massage our assumptions to get the results that we want to hear, rather than the results that come out. Now, we have government advisors here, as you do as well. This is taken from a government chief scientific advisor. Again, I won't say which one it was. We can't tell them, the ministers, the politicians, that 2 degrees C is impossible. We can say it's a stretch, that it's ambitious, but with political will, 2 degrees C is still a feasible target. So we get this language from the academics, from the government advisors. And this is a quote from Ed Miliband, who is now the leader of the Labour Party in the UK, but at the time was the Secretary of State, the head of our Department for Energy and Climate Change, the day before he went to Copenhagen. This is a direct quote in the discussion I had with him that day before. Our position is too challenging, is challenging enough. I can't go with the message that 2 degrees C is impossible. It's what we've all worked towards. So from the academics to the chief scientists to the politicians, no one dare tell the public about where we're heading. And I hear this repeatedly now of all sorts of academics. They will tell me it over a glass of wine or half a litre of beer, but they will not say it to the public that we are heading for 4 and 6 degrees. That it's only just starting to come out. We hide the truth repeatedly. So where does all of this leave us? Well, I think what I'm trying to show is that 2 degrees C looks very difficult. And we often hear then, well, could we go for a higher temperature? Could we go for 4 degrees C as a global temperature rise? I'm going to summarise this very quickly about why we can't go for 4 degrees C. Firstly, we must bear in mind that 4 degrees C is a global mean surface temperature, so that includes the oceans. And the oceans have a big thermal mass. It takes a long time to warm the oceans up. So if we think of the land temperature with 4 degrees C as an average is 5 or 6. And this could be, remember, as early as the middle of this century, just 35, 40 years from now. Now, if you think about that, the regional variations on the hottest days of the year, this is taken from some work with from the Hadley Centre. That would imagine being in Beijing or Shanghai on their hottest days during their heat wave and adding 6 to 8 degrees to that. People already die in these heat waves, and this could be prolonged. If you think of the heat wave in Central Europe that killed 20 to 30,000 people in 2003, add on top of that 8 to 10 degrees C warming. This is where we're heading at the moment. This is where our policies are taking us. And we'll be having infrastructure that was built by people 100 years ago, not designed for busy cities, not designed for these sorts of temperatures, not designed for vulnerable older people particularly. In New York as well, 10 to 12 degrees. Think of the subway and add 10 to 12 degrees. These are worlds that we struggle to live in. And for low latitudes, the suggestions are that this would significantly reduce the production of major crops like maize and rice, at the same time as population is heading towards 9 billion. So my polling on this, my asking of scientists who work in this area, and remember that not many people look at these sorts of high emission futures, is that 4 degrees C is incompatible with the organised global community. They start to see the breakdown of society, probably much more tension, some military tension, the breakdown of agricultural systems, the great breakdown of our transport networks, the breakdown of globalised food distribution. They also say it's likely to be beyond what we can adapt to. Some people may be able to adapt, wealthy people may be able to adapt in some places, but many people will not be able to adapt. They will just be hit by the impacts and have to suffer them or die as a consequence. And as well, many ecosystems, if not most ecosystems, cannot change to this sort of rate of change, cannot adjust to what they do to this high rate of change. Temperatures occurring, a rise in temperature occurring very quickly. And on top of all of this, there's a fairly clear view amongst many of the climate scientists that once you head towards 4 degrees C, this will not be stable. You start to hit tipping points, discontinuities that make the situation worse day in, day out. So it might be 4, 5, 6, 7 or 8. You'll stabilise at another temperature where most of us will not be able to survive any further. And so my conclusion from that is that 4 degrees C must be avoided at all costs. There's no way that we should be heading in that direction. So we have to stick to 2, and even now an outside chance of 2 degrees C. We must not think that 4 is an alternative, because it is not. Now this is all despairing. This all leads us to think this is a very, very sad, depressing future, and I think that is true. But there are things that we can do. I don't think we have to sit here and think it is impossible. We just have to think differently and harder. So what can we do about it? I'm going to give a couple of examples, but before that, let's just think what we need to achieve. This is the sort of thing that Sweden and the UK would need to achieve. We're both very high emitting countries. We need to have about a 10% per annum reduction in emissions from now, which is about it from a few years ago. About a 40% reduction by 2015, 70% by 2020, and basically be fully decarbonised by 2030. That's not just electricity. That's our cars, our planes, our ships, everything that we do, to give a reasonable amount of emission space for the poor parts of the world. That's still giving them very little chance in the poor parts of the world to increase their emissions, and this is for an outside chance of 2 degrees C. Now that's impossible, but my argument is living with 4 degrees C, 5 degrees C, 6 degrees C, is that any less impossible? So the future is impossible. Whether we adapt or mitigate, the future is impossible. So we have to think differently about what we're going to try and do. Now there are things we can do, and I'll whip through these quite quickly, but there are many things that you'll know about. The first one I want to talk about is equity. Firstly, we're not talking about 7 billion people here. The people who are causing this problem are not the poor Chinese. And even if the poor Chinese try to live like us, it will take them 10, 20, 30 years for their income to be sufficiently high to live high carbon lifestyles like we live. So we're talking about a small group. If you apply the 80-20 rule that hopefully some of you are familiar with, Vilfredo Pareto, a famous Italian economist, or as engineers we call it a rule of thumb, 80% of something relates to 20% of those involved, 80% of emissions come from 20% of the population. And if you then look at that 20% and do that same thing again in that 20%, how many of them are emitting the most? What you get is about 50% of the emissions come from 1% of the population. Now this is a guideline, that's all. But what we're saying, and there's some empirical evidence to suggest this is the case, that 40 to 60% of the emissions come from, say, 1 to 5% of the population. Most emissions come from a very small group, and we know who they are. When we shave in the morning, when we put on our makeup, we see them in the mirror. So, who's in that 1 to 5%? Every climate scientist. I've not met one exception so far. Every climate journalist and pontificator. every academic in the OECD, anyone who gets on a plane once a year, anyone in the UK who earns over £30,000. So you have to convert that into krona. So, you know, basically everyone we know, our friends and our families are in this group, and us, of course. And the question we have to ask then, because we can't do this with supply in time. Supply is helpful in the medium and long term. In the short term, it's about demand. And we have to ask, are those of us that are the emitters, the small percentage, are we prepared to change what we do now, not in 20 years' time, now? Are we prepared to have policies enforced on us to change our lifestyles today to lower carbon? I think the answer probably isn't that now, but without the W. At the moment, it's no, we're not. We need to change that. The other one I want to talk through is just about looking at technical things. We always talk about power stations. I'm sure it's the same in Sweden as in the UK. But if we want to provide the light that I'm using here in the room I'm in at the moment, I'm trying to look at the light bulbs where you are. Hopefully Sweden is more efficient than we are. We need some light for electricity. We need a power transmission network. We need some power stations. And we need the Venezuelans or the Colombians or the Australians to dig the coal out of the ground, or the uranium or the gas, whatever it might be. If we start to put some numbers on that, if we want 10 units of useful light, lumens of light, most light bulbs until very recently, and including halogen light bulbs, are very inefficient. So you have to put 50 units of useful energy in. You'll lose between 6 and 10% of the energy, probably 6 to 8% in Sweden, like here. In the distribution and transmission network, the power stations are going to be somewhere between 35 and 45% efficient, maybe 50% if you're lucky. That means most of the energy goes up the chimney, and it'll take you about 10 to 15% of the energy to get the coal out of the ground, onto the train, onto the port, onto a ship, onto another port, onto another train, to the power station every day for 40 years whilst you run the power station. That takes a lot of energy as well. So the demand side, changing something on the light bulb side, completely dwarfs changes on the power station. So there's a huge amount we can do on the demand side. And think about our cars. And I think Sweden may be better than the UK on many things. It's certainly not better when it comes to its cars. I looked at the numbers recently. I think Swedish cars on average are slightly worse than UK cars in terms of their emissions. The average car in the UK and in Sweden is about 150 grams for new cars that we sell, and for ones that we're driving is probably near 170 grams of carbon dioxide per kilometre. The EU legislation for 2015 is 130, but we're able to buy our way out of that. If you're a rich professor, you can buy your way out of that. You won't have to abide by the rules. But in 2008, and earlier for some manufacturers, BMW, Volkswagen, Audi, in fact Volvo as well, have cars that do much, much lower. These are not electric cars, these are not hybrids, these are diesel-powered internal combustion cars with no price premium, are being sold on the forecourts today, and have emissions somewhere between 85 and 110 grams. So why is it we're saying by 2015 they can be 130 on average? They should be, by next year, no car should be sold as more than 110, and they should come down every year after that by 5 to 10 grams. We can do it now. We are selling these cars today. 90% of all vehicle kilometres are travelled by cars that are under 8 years old. So you can change the cars, the fleet of cars, very quickly. If you follow that through, if you had legislation that said it had to be 100 to 110 grams by 2013, 2014, you'd see a 40 to 50% reduction in emissions by 2020 with no new technology. If you then also make it that we drive with slightly more people in the car, so we reduce the occupancy trends, in other words, maybe back to 1.5 to 2 people per car rather than 1.3 people per car that we have in the UK on average, you would have a 60 to 70% reduction from car transport by 2020. That's without public transport, without electric cars, without hybrids. There's a lot that we can do with existing technologies, as well as the things that we need to do, like to cycle, walk, use the public transport more. So there are many things we can do with technologies, and there are many things we can do with behaviour that move us in the direction of a 60 to 70% reduction by 2020, which would be in keeping with our fair contribution for an outside chance of 2 degrees C. So let's conclude all of this. If the science is right, if cumulative emissions maps temperature, and I think the science on this is absolutely clear that is the case, if the poor parts of the world can peak their emissions by 2025 to 2030, that looks ambitious, but is possibly doable if we set some good examples. If we rapidly reduce emissions from deforestation and from food emissions, that is very challenging, but again I think it's doable. If there are no discontinuities, no tipping points out there to make the situation much worse, if the economists are right and a 3 to 4% reduction can be achieved still with economic growth, and we've never seen that historically yet, then 2 degrees C is impossible, virtually impossible. So if we do everything we say we can do, we can't hold to 2 degrees C. Cannot hold to 2 degrees C. And we're heading to 4 degrees C, and it looks like it could be as early as 2050 to 2070. So we have to think very differently. There's a lot more we can do than this. But if we do all the things we say we're going to do, and we're not doing them, we're not going to even hold to 2. This is not meant to be a message of futility. It's a wake-up call of where our rose-tinted, where our optimistic spectacles have brought us. Real hope, if it is to arise at all, will do so from a bare assessment of the scale of the challenge we face now. We have to be honest about where we are today in 2012 in November, and we have done nothing about climate change but watch the emissions go up. And we must be honest about that. But I'm going to finish with a message of hope that I always use from Robert Unger. At every level, the greatest obstacle to transforming the world is we lack the clarity and imagination to conceive that it could be different. The world will be different. It will be different because of adaptation and impacts if we do nothing. But it can be different in a much more positive direction, in a climate resilient, relatively low carbon way, if we can have the clarity and imagination and the courage to act, to move towards a low carbon society. We can do this. We have the technology, we have the behavioural skills, we don't have to rely on the long term, we can do it now, but we're choosing not to at the moment. So on that more upbeat message, I'll finish. So thank you very much for listening so patiently.
Thank you, Kevin. I don't know if I should say that was fantastic because it was a bit disheartening. On the other hand, you were politically correct in one way. You left us on a positive note, which is always good. But definitely you didn't mince any words, and your, I have to quote there, planned economic recession as the only hope of maintaining that 2 degrees is not something that would be particularly popular to communicate. I will start with a question while we open up the floor as well. We're welcoming you all to present any of your questions or pose any of your questions directly to Kevin. I was wondering, actually, in truth, what happens when these dire messages are presented to policymakers? I mean, you presented in the beginning the fact that it was virtually impossible to communicate those messages, but clearly that's out there, and what are the reactions to that? And actually, what kind of policies are we looking at? You mentioned some of the solutions in the end when it came to the equity factor and the technological advancements, but really what kind of policies do we need to see put into place to avoid the extremely dangerous scenario that you're presenting?
Well, firstly, I do spend a lot of time now, increasing amount of time, talking to policymakers and also senior people in businesses. And away from the camera, away from the microphone, they often will accept what you're saying and think this is dire, but there's nothing we can do about it. Everyone says there is nothing we can do about it. And in a sense that gives me some hope, because if people are prepared to accept the scale of the challenge, and most people who actually you discuss this with will say, yes, I can see what you're saying and I don't really disagree. So there's very few people think it's an incorrect message. They think it's a correct message, but they just then say, well, there's nothing we can do. We can't tell other people this. We have to pretend it's much more optimistic. And I think there's some hope in that if everyone says that, then clearly we can accept it. We can do something about it, because everyone always says, I can accept it. It's just other people won't be able to. So we have to be less arrogant, I think, and be more direct with our friends, our family, ourselves, our policymakers, the public in general, and just be honest about where we are. And then we will be able to, I think, we'll be able to start to conceive of some of the solutions that we need to put in place. But the more that we hide this, the more that we say, oh, it's Chatham House rules, I can't say this. I was at an event, just Chatham House rules 2 weeks ago, where a very senior government scientist and someone who very senior in Shell said, I think we're in a 4 degrees C future, even if we mitigate hard, but I can't tell my company, I can't tell the public this. Now that is a disgrace, in my view. Of course we should be honest with the public about what our analysis tells us. What we can do about it, and remember that economic contraction, that's particularly for the western part of the world, for Sweden, for the UK, for the US and so forth, to allow some small space for the poor parts of the world to still grow a little bit and improve their welfare. One thing I think straight away is we need to move away from, and this is probably less of an issue in Sweden, more in the US and the UK, Anglo-Saxon countries, move away from a concept of choice. We believe we have these choices. We should have the right to buy an efficient car or a less efficient car. That right is wrong. Is the wrong way of thinking about it. The people who live on the coastal strip of Bangladesh should have the right to live there without interference from our cars. And as we burn energy in our cars, in our planes, in our power stations, we are stopping them people living good lives. So it's incumbent on us to move to more efficient technologies and behaviours. And I think that means we move away from choice and towards standards and regulations. I'm very strongly opposed to thinking that economics, prices can make the significant difference we need to bring about, because their prices would have to be so high to bring about the changes, they would have big equity implications. So I think we have to be really very direct about this and use legislation and standards, and maybe complement them with economic price mechanisms. But we cannot do this with price and markets. We need a much more stringent driver. We also need examples. We need to have people who are doing this and showing it can be done. And some examples are already out there where big reductions have occurred. We need to look at them, learn from them, and then multiply them, replicate them elsewhere, and put policies in place that help us move in that direction. But we can put standards in place in the next year that would rapidly drive down our emissions. The other thing I think we could consider are some forms of carbon rationing. This could be an individual form of carbon rationing, which I quite like the idea of now, but there are other ways of doing this as well. And people say we don't like rationing, but everyone in the audience is rationed by their salary, by their income. Our whole lives are rationed, and we juggle the resources we can buy and afford by our salary. I'm just saying we should also be juggling how we use our carbon, because that should be rationed as well.
Good, thank you, Kevin. Wow. Any questions from the audience? Do I see a raise of hands? And we'll pass around the microphone. You're just also dumbstruck, I imagine, by this threatening scenario still, and the prospect of carbon rationing or budgets. Stefan.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stefan Henningsson from WWF as well. It is a hard word to say. I was wondering, Kevin, as well, you say that we have all technology, and we, to a very large extent, agree from WWF that we can create a pretty much 100% renewable energy future with existing technology. But in industrial emissions, you didn't talk so much of industrial emissions. I think it will come up in the next talk here with the import of embedded carbon. And what are your views on that in terms of what we need to do with industrial emissions, whether that is in Annex 1 countries or Annex 2 countries, in order to deal with that? Because, yeah, that was the question basically.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we have to take account in the wealthy parts of the world now. I have an Apple laptop that was made in China, I think, and I think who should have the emissions for that? The Chinese or me over here? The Chinese clearly gets an economic benefit from me buying the laptop from them, but I'm also getting the carbon benefit of them having to put up with the emissions. So in the short to medium term, I think it is incumbent on the wealthy parts of the world, the Annex 1 countries, to actually take the majority of the emissions from the goods that we import. So if we are exporting our manufacture to other parts of the world, then I think the emissions associated with the goods that we then buy back should be associated with the Annex 1 countries. Now, as we move forward and countries become more industrialised, I think it's a choice that they can make. A country can choose to be a manufacturing country, a service country, country or not. And of course, the price of its goods may well go up if it has to move towards, if renewable energy is more expensive, as some people say it is. I'm less convinced by that argument, but if it is, then the price of goods will have to go up. And I think then, as countries become more equal in their processes of industrialisation, then I think we can allow countries to make the choices of whether they want to manufacture for other countries or not. But at the moment, it is quite plainly and evidently unfair for the West to give the emissions burden to the poorer parts of the world, and in that I do include China, and then just say, oh look, we're doing very well on our emissions. We have to take full account, comprehensive account of our emissions, whether that's from shipping, from planes, from our indigenous energy use, or from the goods that we purchase from other parts of the world. And also in doing that, that gives us a handle on changing the energy systems elsewhere in the world. Because as consumers, we have a right to put pressure on the manufacturers, wherever they are, to use technologies that we would be happier with them to use. So we could start to think about putting rules on that say we will only import goods that have a low carbon footprint in their manufacture. We do that already with leaded toys. We're not allowed to buy toys that have lead-based paints because they're dangerous. So why are we allowing ourselves to buy in goods that have a high carbon footprint? Because they're also dangerous. In fact, a lot more dangerous than lead-based toys. So we already use international trade's criteria to control imports and exports of goods, and I think we should be seriously considering including carbon in that, so that we cannot no longer be importing high carbon goods, and that will put an incentive on poor parts of the world to improve their energy systems, which I think we should be helping them with as well.
Thank you, Kevin. We have one more question, and I can just suggest that you shut down your presentation, because then we'll get to see you in larger-than-life format on the screen.
Let me just try and do that. I'm not quite sure how I shut it down here with my, let me have a look.
Just unplug it.
This isn't as straightforward as it may seem here, because I've not used this machine before.
You can just
Can you see me better now or not?
No, if you just unplug it. Sorry.
Just unplug it, that
Just
will work,
unplug
will it?
it.
Okay.
Thank you.
It'll save energy as well. Is that better?
That's great, that's great.
I'm not sure that you really want to have a closer look at me. I think my slides are more attractive.
Well, I am Per Gatton, chairperson of Cogito. Your presentation, I don't doubt it at all, but it makes me very chilly. I get a chilly feeling concerning democracy. I mean, having been a parliamentarian in Sweden and the European Parliament for decades, I'm just wondering, how will it be possible to find democratic majorities for that kind of proposals and that kind of policy? And then I see that China is awakening. China is starting to do a lot of things around these problems. Do we see the end of democracy as we know it? Will China take the lead with its system? I know there are a lot of conflicts in China also, of course, but that's made me really chilly. I mean, how could we find measures to make these huge changes while preserving democracy, not having to sacrifice democracy to make this needed enormous change?
This is a question actually I've been asked increasingly, and I think firstly I would step back and say, do we have democracy? I'm going to think about this from the UK perspective, and I don't know the situation in Sweden. It may be quite similar. We have a lot of planning rules here, so if you want to build a wind turbine or a nuclear power station or whatever it wants to be, you have to get a planning permission, and that requires a lot of local people to say whether they think it's a good or a bad idea. So if people will often oppose, for instance, I'm talking about wind turbines, a lot of people will oppose wind turbines. And we would say that's part of the process of democracy, that local people can engage in these issues. Except for, to me, the local people related to wind turbines are the 30 million people who live within the 1 metre sea level rise coastline of Bangladesh. They are the local people to the impacts of whether we build the turbines in Britain or not. So the democracy that we have at the moment is partial. It says the people around the thing that we're building, we'll ask you what you think, but the people impacted by whether you build it or don't build it, we're not going to ask you. Now that's not democracy. Asking 400 local people and ignoring 30 million people who may be impacted by it is not democracy in my view. It's worse than democracy. It's worse than not having democracy. It's the worst future that you can have, when it's like, or worst structure you can have. So you then start to say, well, is it really democracy? Are we talking here about a global issue that requires us to think differently about how we get citizen engagement? And I would argue that we get that here through employing our policymakers to have at international negotiations. And those policymakers, the people of Bangladesh, speak through their policymakers, who then put constraints on targets that then are negotiated internationally. And those targets then are attributed out to different countries, and we are obliged by that process of democracy, by people engaging through their policymakers, to meet those criteria. So that means then if Sweden or the UK says we must meet 2 degrees C, these are the reduction rates, those reduction rates have been determined by democracy. The problem is our partial democracy, our NIMBYism, our preference for what we like ourselves, our selfishness, says we don't really like the outputs rather of that honestly much more democratic process. So we then override it, and we override it on the name of democracy. Now I'm not sure how that makes sense. What I'm saying is that once you get a global democracy engaged in something, that often says that actually the local people will be wanting things that are good for them but are bad for the planet or bad for other people on the planet, and then we use the argument of local democracy to say, oh, this is all too bad, we can't do it, we can't get support. And I think it is a failing of democracy not to have engaged people who will be impacted by climate change in the decisions that we make in Sweden and the UK about our emissions, about the technologies we use, about the legislation that we put in place, and that is not democratic. When it comes to places like China, they are doing a lot, and there's an argument that top-down top-down legislation is a much more constructive way of rapid way of bringing about the rates of change that we need to see. And that does infringe on our supposedly liberal attitudes within the West. But when you start talking about global issues, I don't think there's a real alternative around that. And the other bit I would suggest on this, if we look at Sweden and compare it with the UK and the US, the Swedes have a democratic process. You have much more of your GDP spent by the state than we have. You have a much more top-down, statist, government-driven structure, and I think one that's much more positive than we have in the UK, I have to say, and the same in Norway, which I have more experience of. So already, what I would argue, if you looked at Sweden compared with the UK or the US, that you are a much more centrally planned, top-down country. You are much nearer China than we are. You're China, but with the good bits kept and the bad bits maybe not kept. That's overplaying Sweden's hand, I think. So I think we have examples already where the state can intervene, where things can be done and pushed through that do not completely override democratic process and principles. Most people would say Sweden is a democratic country, but it's not a free market Anglo-Saxon country. It's a much more statist, centralist, central planning country with a very high threshold towards what it thinks is important for welfare. So I think these are not necessarily all negative things that we have to think about. So I've tried to summarise this, which has been a bit rambling, I'm sorry, but it's we have to think of democracy on a world scale, not just in relation to our own backyard. And when we do that, I think our decisions are actually much more democratic than when we make them locally. And even then, I think we have to think that many parts of the world, China or Sweden, are good examples, or many parts of continental Europe, good examples where government can actively represent its own citizens and citizens elsewhere and move things in a much more positive direction, much more rapidly than is the Anglo-Saxon, the British or the US model. So in that sense, I think the UK can learn from Sweden and perhaps Sweden can learn from China.
Great, Kevin, thank you. Accolades to the Swedish political system, which is very close to the Chinese. Something new for us today. On the other hand, everyone in this room and probably the majority of the 9 million Swedes probably account for your 1% that you were talking about globally, who would basically need to radically reduce our emissions as of yesterday. So
yes.
Regardless of the political system, centralized government, etc., which is not quite the way it's always been portrayed to be, we needed to stop doing things quite a while ago. And who in here has not flown for the last year? Is there anyone in this room? Wow. That's fantastic. Amazing.
Has anyone not flown for the last 5 years?
Whoa. A few fewer.
That's still good.
Yeah, and I would say also this isn't quite representative of the population in general, but God, accolades, fantastic. So any other questions before we say thank you and goodbye to Kevin? One last question here from Glen Peters.
Yep, you hear me? Just a quite quick question. Can it be done without nuclear?
Yes, I think it probably can be, but if we think about it, certainly for Sweden, yes. For many of the European countries, I think we have the technology and the renewable resource to do it without nuclear. But we can't do it without, from our own work, we can't do it without nuclear, certainly the Annex 1 countries, unless we radically reduce our demand. And I would suggest that we could probably have not that dissimilar levels of welfare to those that we have today, with somewhere about a 50 to 70% reduction in our demand for energy. So we could basically lead the lives or the welfare quality of the lives we have today with 50 to 70% less energy. And if that's the case, then I think we have much more chance of doing it without nuclear power. If, however, we choose to do it just by a low carbon supply route, and anyway, from a time perspective, you can't build nuclear power stations fast enough, then if we use lots more energy, then we'll have to probably have some nuclear power in the future. But I think we have to also be careful with nuclear power that uranium-235 is a scarce resource. There are different estimates as to how much is available. Some people say as little as 40 years, other people say it's in seawater and you can get it out for many more decades, but it's very expensive to get it out. If we think about fast-breeder reactors or thorium reactors, we have not built any of these that have been reliable over the long term. So at the moment, uranium is the main constraint on nuclear power designs and the ones that we're building. So I think we have to be quite careful to assume that nuclear power is somehow a free form of energy that just goes on forever. It is constrained, as is oil or gas. And it takes a long time to build. And the most important point in all this, as the curves show, we do not have the time to build the nuclear power stations. They currently provide about 3% of world energy, I think, between 3 and 8. So they're a very small level of percentage of energy generated, of energy used, is produced by nuclear power. To increase that significantly would take us decades, and we don't have decades.
Okay. I'm sorry, one last question here from Dale Wen, and I'll pass the microphone.
How about shale gas? Because right now it looks like United States is really going headlong towards developing shale gas or even shale oil, and it seems they are also getting China on board to have big joint development project for shale gas.
Right. This is quite a complex issue. It's one that I've done a lot of work on with my colleagues in the Tyndall Centre here over the last 2 years. Let's firstly start off that gas is not a low carbon fuel. 75% of the atomic weight of gas is carbon. So gas is a high carbon fuel. It's just lower than coal, which is about as bad as you can get. Where we have seen shale gas used, the argument is, does it substitute for coal? Because the climate doesn't care whether carbon dioxide comes from shale, from coal, from Sweden, from the US, from anywhere else. It doesn't care. It just adds up the amount of molecules of carbon dioxide and changes the climate accordingly. So then you have to ask the question: does it substitute? And our argument is that it is very unlikely to substitute in the absence of a global carbon cap, or governments that are prepared to keep the coal in the ground. So if you look at the US has had a slight reduction in its carbon dioxide emissions. That's not driven solely by shale gas. They've got more renewables, but also they've had an economic decline to some degree. But shale gas has been part of that story. So the question then is, well, isn't that a good thing? Well, but then you have to look at the coal exports from the US. The coal exports have gone up. In fact, those coal exports have gone up, and some of that's coming to Europe that's burnt more coal. So the coal is not being kept in the ground. The coal is being dug up and it's being combusted. And unless you can absolutely guarantee that you use shale gas and you keep the coal in the ground, then you're not doing anything good about climate change. It is worse than using shale gas. The climate now sees the CO2 from shale gas and the CO2 from coal. So there are real issues about this. If you look at the emission curves for the Annex 1 countries, there is literally no space for shale gas. Shale gas is a complete distraction. We have no time. We have to be looking to zero carbon by 2030 to give us an outside chance of 2 degrees C. And if we are serious about what we've signed up to, then shale gas cannot fit into that. Even with carbon capture and storage, you're still going to have probably somewhere in the region of 50 to 100 grams of carbon per kilowatt hour. So carbon capture and storage is nowhere near enough zero for it to be considered viable in the Annex 1 countries. And this is a really uncomfortable message, but we cannot use fossil fuels at all here. Now, if you went to China, I think it's where you mentioned, I think there's an argument that shale gas could be used in China, preferably as a substitute for coal. But I also think it might be that it's more practical for using it as LNG in transport as well, because that can actually help with some of the air quality issues in some of the cities in China. So you can help with health issues. It's not a climate change issue, but it's a health issue. So I think that in poorer parts of the world, shale gas, if it is a genuine substitute for coal, is a good move, but it's not as good as moving towards renewables. But in the short term, I don't think the poor parts of the world can make a sufficiently quick transition to renewables, and shale gas is something that they could implement quite quickly, but it must not displace the renewables, and it must displace the coal. It must keep the coal in the ground. So there's a difference between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1. Annex 1 countries, shale gas is not part of a 2 degree story. Non-Annex 1 parts of the world, shale gas may be a transition fuel, but only if we're very careful about how we use it.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And I'll have to use an executive right here and end the question and answers with you for today. We could probably go on forever and ever, but we have a couple of other points on the agenda. So thank you very much for scaring the heck out of us, but also providing food for thought and for helping us actually frame the discussions that will take place here when we say goodbye to you. So thank you,
Okay,
and we'll keep you in mind. Can't avoid it, I think.